Happy Independence Day, Church. I hope it's a restful and wonderful holiday weekend. I called my moms this morning. My sister volunteered my mom to host the 4th of July party today. And so the firefighters will be there and everybody else. And I said, well, y'all might as well come on by later on. So, and I told Mom, I said, I asked her this morning, how are things going? And she said, well, the fireworks aren't supposed to start until 9 o'clock tonight. I said, bye, I'll see you later. All is well, and as families gather on these holidays, it's always a chance, certainly, to celebrate together, but there are also days that we're asked to remember. Remember who we are and what we're called to be as a nation. Not necessarily where we are as a nation at this point in history, but who we're called to be. And the founding vision of our country, of those who have gone before us. How many years is it this day, church? 234 years. 10:30 Mass gets the prize because at 4:30 and at 8:30 everybody's counting and trying to figure it out. 234 years. And while it may seem like a long time to us, because the Psalms say that our span is 70 years, or 80 if we're strong, 200 years in the course of the history of the world and the universe is a mere drop in the bucket. It is hardly a puddle, a ripple in the pool of life. But for us, 234 years represents a significant accomplishment. I remember when we celebrated the bicentennial 34 years ago, and it seems just like yesterday. In remembering those days and events and calling us to remember today who we are as a nation, we celebrate freedom. We celebrate freedom, we celebrate liberty, we celebrate the vision of those who founded this land. But we also know that there are challenges to that vision. That as the framers of the Declaration of Independence wrote, that there are certain inalienable rights that belong to every person, namely life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And each one having the ability and the freedom to pursue that. And yet, in the 19th century, there was an author who did a great work of history on the various civilizations of the world. And his observations, based on his research, said that most great nations last only about 200 years. And that there is a cycle through which nations go. And the first of those situations that gives rise to the birth of a nation is enslavement. Slavery leads to faith. Because only when we find ourselves unable to be free and to exercise the freedom that we believe has been given us, there's only one place we can turn to for hope. There's only one person who knows what's going on in our lives. And in our ancestry, we know the story of the Israelites and the Egyptians. It was in their enslavement that they were able to come to deep faith and trust in their God. So much so that they were willing to follow Moses out in the desert. Slavery leads to faith. Faith leads to courage. Courage. Courage is that which allows us to move and act in a way that on our own we might not be able to. It gives us that deep conviction that there is something greater than ourselves that makes us move forward. Slavery to faith, to courage. Courage leads to freedom. Only when one has the courage to be able to step out in faith and be able to move on can they begin to move into a new moment of freedom and a new moment of growth in their lives. Freedom leads to prosperity. Freedom leads to prosperity. those freedoms exercised allow us to grow in those resources that we have, and freedom and prosperity then lead to abundance. We as a nation have experienced abundance for quite a long time. And yet, we find ourselves in one of those, what we call a liminal moment. We're betwixt, we're between. We're not sure what direction we're really moving in. We understand that these are the first generations now that will not be able to sustain the wealth of their parents and grandparents. Up to this point, everyone knew that there was a better life waiting. There were more resources and jobs available. And yet we know well that even today, if you have a master's or even a doctorate, there is no guarantee that there is a job waiting for you. We find ourselves in this in-between moment. Even as we have moved from slavery to faith, to courage, to freedom, to abundance, we now find ourselves beginning to face some other issues. And Mr. Title in his work describes that we move from abundance to selfishness. That we begin to focus on what I need, what I can get, what I can have. And that selfishness leads to resentment. Selfishness leads to resentment because there are others who have what I think I should have. And resentment leads to isolation. We find ourselves cut off from those around us. Isolation leads us to dependence, because we can no longer act and move on our accord, and we move from dependence back to slavery. It is a cycle that he traced throughout some of the great civilizations and nations of the world. And sisters and brothers, I would wonder where we are in that cycle if it continues to hold true. If we look simply at our nation and at our world, we might each have some very different ideas about where we are in the moments of our history as a nation. But you and I are not simply citizens of this country. We are citizens of heaven. We are citizens of a reign that is unfolding in our midst. We are those who belong not to this world, but to God's world, the reign of God. Jesus says, live in this world, but don't be of this world. And so the challenge for us on this Independence Day, I believe, is to really reflect upon where